Dark nights, flashing sirens, and a city caught between old crime empires and new chaos. New York in the 1990s was more than hip-hop, fashion, and Wall Street dreams. Behind the neon glow, a different map of the city existed, one drawn in fear. Whole neighborhoods were ruled not by police or politicians, but by ruthless street crews and gangs that answered only to their own codes. Why did these gangs rise just when the city promised revival? Who were the faces behind the headlines, mysterious kingpins, young recruits, double-life hustlers? And how did an era of pagers and payphones create networks that even seasoned detectives struggled to trace? Tonight, we pull back the curtain on a turbulent decade when New York's underworld reinvented itself. This is Gangs of 90s New York that terrorized the city. City on edge. The winter wind cut through New York like a blade, but the real chill in the early 90s wasn't in the air. It was in the atmosphere of the streets. Newspapers carried daily counts of robberies and shootings. Parents warned kids not to linger after school. Taxi drivers avoided certain blocks after dark, no matter how good the tip might be. People felt it everywhere. The city was on edge, and no one knew when the next headline might explode. This tension didn't appear overnight. The late 1980s had already left a deep scar. The crack cocaine epidemic had swept through neighborhoods like a sudden storm, leaving addiction, broken families, and rival dealers fighting for corners. The murder rate climbed to one of the highest in the city's history. By 1990, it was common to hear police sirens in the distance almost every hour, a background soundtrack to daily life. Whole sections of the city felt neglected. Abandoned buildings stood as dark skeletons of failed housing projects. Streetlights flickered out and stayed unrepaired for weeks. In some neighborhoods, calling the police felt pointless. By the time an officer arrived, trouble had already moved on. This created pockets of lawlessness where street crews and local gangs could quietly build their own authority. Economically, the city was split. Wall Street was booming, and glittering towers of finance filled lower Manhattan with wealth and optimism. But only a few subway stops away, unemployment among young people soared. For teenagers facing bleak job prospects, gangs sometimes looked less like danger and more like opportunity, offering fast cash, a sense of belonging and protection in a rough environment. Cultural shifts added another layer. Hip-hop was becoming the voice of the streets, telling stories of struggle and survival that resonated with young listeners. Music videos and graffiti became unofficial news channels, spreading the reputation of certain neighborhoods and names long before social media existed. The energy was creative and inspiring, but it also carried the raw anger of a generation that felt unseen. The city government tried to respond. New programs were launched to clean up graffiti, increase police patrols, and support youth centers. Yet for many residents, these steps felt too slow compared to the speed of street life. If a corner became known for drug dealing on Monday, by Friday, it might already belong to a new crew. Gangs were flexible, mobile, and quick to seize opportunities. Even in iconic areas like Times Square, danger mixed with bright lights. Behind the neon signs were adult theaters, illegal gambling rooms, and small-time hustlers. Tourists might buy a ticket for a Broadway show, but they also carried the uneasy sense that trouble was only a side street away. Late-night TV hosts joked about the chaos, but for New Yorkers, it was an everyday calculation. Where to walk, when to move, whom to trust. The subway system symbolized the city's tension perfectly. Graffiti-covered cars rattled through dark tunnels, a moving canvas of rebellion and warning. Muggings on trains were frequent enough that some riders developed silent strategies, standing near the conductor's booth, avoiding empty cars, keeping cash separate from valuables. The underground felt like a city within a city, with its own unwritten rules. Meanwhile, older crime empires were quietly watching. The traditional mafia, still powerful, but under legal pressure, began shifting from noisy confrontations to more hidden money-making schemes. Their silent presence set the stage for unexpected alliances and rivalries with the street gangs that would soon rise. New York in the early 90s was a paradox, a place of enormous culture and creativity, but also a city bracing for the next shock. Every borough had its own mix of hope and fear. People kept living, working, and dreaming, but always with one eye on the street. And in that atmosphere, half opportunity, half threat, new players were preparing to make their move. The old underworld wasn't gone, it was evolving. To see how that next chapter unfolded, we have to look at the powerful shadows of the traditional crime families who were about to cross paths with a new generation of gangs in ways few expected. Legacy of the Five Families. Long before the flashy headlines of the 90s, the story of organized crime in New York had already been written in smoke-filled backrooms and quiet waterfront deals. The so-called Five Families, the Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo clans, were not just figures from old gangster films. They were real power structures with deep roots in the city's economy and politics. By the start of the 1990s, they had survived decades of police crackdowns and shifting markets. But survival meant adaptation, and that's where the decade's drama began. Imagine the city at the turn of the decade. On the surface, the big mafia trials of the 80s had shaken these families. John Gotti, the self-styled Dapper Don, was sentenced to life in 1992 after years of headlines. Prosecutors celebrated, newspapers declared a turning point, and many New Yorkers believed the age of the old mob was ending. Yet inside the families, a quieter plan was unfolding. Leaders learned from Gotti's very public fall. The new generation of bosses and underbosses avoided the limelight. Flashy suits and late-night TV cameos gave way to unmarked sedans and whispered meetings in out-of-the-way diners. They focused on business that left fewer traces: construction, waste management, garment trucking, and complex financial schemes. Money laundering through seemingly legitimate companies became a core strategy, letting profits flow without drawing attention. But the families didn't abandon the streets completely. In many neighborhoods, especially in parts of Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island, their influence still meant something. Construction projects often required consultation fees. Nightclubs and bars quietly paid for protection. Even as new street gangs rose, the mafia's networks of connections, from union leaders to city officials, gave them leverage that raw violence alone could not buy. What made the 90s particularly interesting was how these old powers intersected with emerging groups. Young Latin crews, newly arrived Russian-speaking outfits, and prison-born gangs like the Bloods and Crips often needed access to certain markets, drugs, weapons, or nightlife venues. The Five Families, with decades of contacts and distribution routes, sometimes acted as silent partners or back-end suppliers. These were not formal alliances carved in stone, but practical arrangements born from mutual need. Inside each family, internal politics remained intense. Succession fights, betrayals, and secret recordings kept federal agents busy. In some cases, the pressure to stay low profile led to smaller, more disciplined operations. In others, it triggered violent disputes when ambitious captains tried to push out cautious elders. These quiet but fierce battles shaped the way the mafia operated through the decade. Law enforcement adapted too. The Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, gave prosecutors a powerful weapon to target entire hierarchies, not just foot soldiers. Wiretaps and undercover agents exposed once sacred rituals of initiation. Yet each time investigators celebrated a major bust, the families regrouped. Like an old tree pruning a branch, they shed exposed operations and shifted energy into new ventures. For ordinary New Yorkers, the mafia's presence felt different than in the hard-edged 70s. There were fewer open shootings connected to mob wars, but rumors of hidden control remained. People in certain trades knew which contractors to avoid, which restaurants doubled as meeting spots, and which seemingly small trucking companies actually linked to multi-million-dollar deals. Culturally, the fascination never faded. Movies like Goodfellas and Casino turned mob life into a kind of dark glamour. But behind the Hollywood glow, real bosses were quietly signing agreements, influencing unions, and sometimes lending advice or resources to rising street gangs that shared their neighborhoods. By the mid-90s, the five families were no longer the single dominant force in New York crime. Yet they were far from gone. Instead, they became silent architects of a new criminal landscape, where old traditions met fresh energy. Their ability to shift from brute force to quiet finance kept them relevant, even as headlines moved on to newer names and colors. This hidden partnership between old and new worlds set the stage for the next big wave of change. While the mafia focused on subtle influence, another current of gang culture, straight from the opposite coast, was about to burst onto the scene, with bold colors and unmistakable style. The arrival of the Bloods and Crips would add a new, unpredictable layer to New York's underworld story. Bloods and Crips arrive. The mid-90s brought a jolt that even seasoned New Yorkers didn't fully see coming. Bright red bandanas and deep blue flag symbols that once belonged mainly to Los Angeles started showing up in Harlem corners, Bronx schoolyards, and Brooklyn basketball courts. At first, it looked like a passing style, but these colors carried a far bigger meaning. The Bloods and the Crips, two of America's most recognized street organizations, had arrived, and with them came a new chapter of tension and transformation. It all began inside the city's own jail system. Rikers Island, one of the largest urban prisons in the world, was a pressure cooker of rival groups in the early 90s. Young inmates from different boroughs were often forced to band together for safety. Among them were men who had spent time on the West Coast or who had family ties there. They brought stories, symbols, and rules from Los Angeles, where the Bloods and Crips had already built decades of fierce identity. Inside Rikers, those stories took on a life of their own. What started as informal protection crews gradually adopted the names, colors, and codes of the Bloods and Crips. By the time some of these inmates returned to their neighborhoods, they carried a brand that was instantly recognizable and among some youth strangely respected. The names spread faster than any official organization could plan. On the outside, the city was ready soil for this growth. Young people in many neighborhoods faced long unemployment lines and few chances to move ahead. Music videos and hip-hop lyrics celebrated toughness and local pride, giving the red and blue flags a kind of rebellious shine. Joining wasn't always about crime at first. For some, it was about friendship, safety, and belonging to something bigger than the chaos around them. But identity quickly shaped action. Once different sets of Bloods or Crips formed, territory and reputation became central. Simple disputes, a borrowed jacket, a comment in a rap lyric could turn into serious conflicts when colors and crews were involved. Fights that might once have been one-on-one suddenly carried the weight of an entire neighborhood. Law enforcement struggled to keep pace. Traditional policing was built to chase individual suspects or establish crime families with clear hierarchies. The new gangs were looser. They operated in small sets, each with its own leaders and style. Some focused on local hustles, others on the drug trade. Tracking them was like trying to follow quicksilver fluid, unpredictable and constantly changing shape. Community reactions were mixed. Some residents worried about the sudden rise in group-related violence. Others recognized that these young men and women were also products of neglect and poverty. Local mentors, church leaders, and youth programs worked hard to offer alternatives, creating sports leagues and art projects to pull energy away from the streets. These grassroots efforts sometimes succeeded, but the lure of belonging could be powerful. The media, meanwhile, amplified the mystique. News stories highlighted dramatic incidents, robberies, confrontations, and police raids, often focusing on the most sensational details. TV segments and magazine covers turned the Bloods and Crips into near-mythic figures, feeding both fear and fascination. Ironically, that attention sometimes boosted recruitment, as young people saw their neighborhood sets suddenly treated as famous. By the late 90s, the Bloods and Crips were not only an established presence in several boroughs, but also influencing fashion and slang citywide. Red and blue clothing showed up in music videos filmed in New York. Rap battles borrowed West Coast imagery. Even those with no gang ties knew the colors and the codes, a sign of how deeply the symbols had entered popular culture. Still, the story of the Bloods and Crips in New York was not just about conflict. Some former members later turned their energy toward community projects, mentoring younger kids and speaking publicly about their experiences. Their voices added complexity to a narrative that outsiders often reduced to simple violence. As the decade moved on, these groups would intersect with other powerful forces. Latino gangs, with deep local roots and strong organization, were already building their own networks, sometimes clashing with, sometimes learning from the newcomers. To see how that next layer unfolded, we turn to the story of the Latin Kings and the Netters, whose influence across the 90s would reshape the very idea of organized street power in New York. Latin Kings and Netters, power in numbers. New York nights carried a different pulse when the Latin Kings stepped onto the streets. Gold and black colors, careful hand signs, and tightly structured meetings set them apart from the looser, flashier sets around them. In the mid-90s, when many gangs formed almost by accident, the Latin Kings looked more like an organized movement than a neighborhood crew. Their rivals, the Netters, matched that intensity with their own discipline and pride. Together, these two Latino forces created one of the most dramatic chapters in the city's gang history. The Latin Kings had roots stretching back to the 1950s in Chicago, but New York gave the group a unique life. By the early 90s, the city's Puerto Rican and wider Latino communities were wrestling with economic challenges and social neglect. Many young people faced language barriers, overcrowded schools, and limited jobs. The King's promise of brotherhood, cultural respect, and mutual protection struck a deep chord. Joining wasn't just about the street. It felt like a statement of identity. Initiations were serious. Members pledged loyalty during carefully planned ceremonies that mixed Spanish-language prayers, symbols of heritage, and strict codes of behavior. These rituals gave members a sense of dignity and belonging, that many said they couldn't find elsewhere. The group even used the word nation to describe itself, hinting at a vision bigger than any one borough. Their influence wasn't limited to back alleys. The Latin Kings held organized meetings, sometimes in public parks, where leaders discussed neighborhood issues and community events alongside street business. Music, poetry, and political talk were part of their gatherings. In a decade when many gangs were defined only by violence, the Kings' blend of culture and structure gave them a distinctive presence. Yet the street economy remained a powerful magnet. Some chapters financed themselves through drug trade or extortion, and disputes with rivals often turned intense. The Netas, originally formed in Puerto Rico's prison system to defend inmate rights, had also grown into a disciplined New York network. They emphasized solidarity and mutual aid, but were equally ready to defend their members when challenged. Clashes between the Kings and the Netas sometimes flared suddenly, fueled by territory, pride, and old grudges carried across the ocean. For neighborhoods caught in the middle, life could feel unpredictable. One block might host a lively cultural festival sponsored by a gang-affiliated community group, while the next block witnessed a late-night fight linked to the same network. Parents tried to steer their children towards safer activities, but the allure of strong identity and instant respect was hard to counter. The police response reflected the city's shifting crime strategy. Detectives began to map the organizational charts of these groups, using surveillance and long investigations rather than quick arrests. RICO laws, already used against the mafia, became a tool for targeting gang leadership. But sweeping crackdowns sometimes swept up young people whose only crime was hanging out with the wrong friends. Community leaders argued that heavy-handed raids risked alienating the very residents whose cooperation was vital. Culturally, the Latin Kings and Netas influenced fashion, music, and even local politics. Their colors appeared in hip-hop videos and street murals. Some members worked with neighborhood associations, advocating for better housing or youth programs. This dual image part community activists, part feared street force confused outsiders and fascinated journalists. By the late 90s, leadership struggles and police pressure began to reshape both groups. Some factions focused on social outreach, while others doubled down on underground business. Internal debates grew intense. Should they present themselves as cultural movements or accept the label of criminal gangs? The answer often depended on which borough you visited and which set you met. What remained clear was their influence. They had proved that street organizations could be more than loose bands of fighters. They could become structured communities with their own culture, rules, and even political ambitions. That idea would inspire and challenge the next generation of Latino crews. Just uptown and across the rivers, a newer force was already gathering momentum. Dominican youths, many with ties to Washington Heights and the Bronx, were shaping a group that would soon leave a powerful mark on the city's map. The rise of the Trinitarios was about to add another bold chapter to New York's 90s gang story. Trinitarios and the rise of Dominican crews. Washington Heights in the mid-90s hummed with life open-air markets, lively music spilling from corner bodegas, and late-night conversations on stoops. Yet beneath the rhythm of Dominican culture, a new and tightly bonded force was forming. Young men, many of them recent arrivals or first-generation Dominican Americans, began to unite under a name that would soon echo far beyond Upper Manhattan and the Bronx, the Trinitarios. The spark started in prison. Like several other major New York gangs, the Trinitarios were born behind bars. Dominican inmates, feeling outnumbered and vulnerable, in the tense environment of Rikers Island, created a brotherhood for protection and support. They drew on symbols of Dominican pride: green for hope, white for peace, and red for the blood of heritage. Once released, members carried those colors and that commitment back to their neighborhoods. What set the Trinitarios apart was their combination of tight discipline and deep cultural identity. They didn't just gather on corners. They held structured meetings with codes of conduct. Members often referred to themselves as a family, stressing loyalty and mutual defense. In a city where many young immigrants felt invisible or misunderstood, the group offered recognition and strength. Life in Washington Heights during this period provided fertile ground. The neighborhood bustled with hard-working families, small businesses, and vibrant music scenes. But it also faced the familiar struggles of crowded housing, low-wage jobs, and the lingering presence of drug markets. For some young men, the Trinitarios seemed like a way to stand tall amid those pressures. Membership promised respect and the protection of brothers who shared their language and stories. As the group grew, so did its ambitions. Early activities often revolved around defending territory and looking out for members. Over time, some sets branched into illicit trades, street-level drug sales, or control of local nightlife. Police noted their willingness to defend turf fiercely, which quickly built a reputation across the Bronx and beyond. Their green flags became both a warning and a badge of identity. Community reactions were layered and complex. Parents worried about safety and the pull of gang life. At the same time, many admired the strong Dominican pride the Trinitarios displayed, from flags at block parties to support for local baseball teams. Some older members tried to channel that energy into cultural events or youth mentoring, hoping to steer the younger generation toward education and steady work. Law enforcement, learning from earlier encounters with the Latin kings and bloods, began to monitor the Trinitarios carefully. Detectives pieced together their structure and rituals, using long investigations and undercover officers to understand the inner circle. Still, the group's flexibility and neighborhood support made quick suppression difficult. They were not just a street crew. They were interwoven with the social fabric of Washington Heights and parts of the Bronx. Music and media soon picked up on their story. Dominican hip-hop and merengue urbano artists referenced the pride and struggles of their community, sometimes alluding to the tensions without naming names. Local newspapers debated whether the Trinitarios were primarily a cultural movement, a gang, or something in between. The truth often depended on which members and which moments one chose to highlight. By the late 90s, the Trinitarios had become a recognized presence in the city's underworld. They had proven that a gang built on immigrant identity could grow rapidly and command real influence. Their combination of discipline and neighborhood loyalty made them stand out in a crowded landscape of street organizations. But New York's criminal scene was not limited to the Latino world. Downtown, in the narrow streets of Chinatown, another set of secretive but highly organized groups had been working quietly for decades. These Chinese-American tongs and triads were about to remind the city that some of the most powerful networks operate far from public view, setting the stage for the next chapter of our story. Chinatown tongs and triads. Even as gang colors and loud street battles drew attention uptown, a quieter but equally potent network was thriving downtown. Walk through the narrow streets of Manhattan's Chinatown in the mid-90s, and you would smell fresh dumplings, hear the chatter of mahjong tiles, and see families shopping late into the evening. But behind many unmarked doors and inside basement tea parlors, a different world operated one, ruled by Chinese-American Tongs and international triads. These organizations had deep historical roots. Tongs began in the 19th century as mutual aid societies, helping immigrants find work and protection in a foreign land. Over time, some developed darker sides, taking part in gambling, loan sharking, and smuggling. By the 1990s, they had matured into complex groups with both legal fronts and hidden operations, blending community service with secret criminal ventures. Unlike the street gangs that announce themselves with graffiti and bright colors, the Chinatown networks valued discretion. Meetings might take place in the back room of a bustling restaurant or an upstairs office behind a quiet herbal shop. The walls of these rooms could tell stories of negotiations over gambling profits, counterfeit goods, or secret shipments arriving through the busy New York harbor. One of the most striking examples of their reach surfaced in 1994 with the Golden Venture case. A cargo ship ran aground near Queens, carrying hundreds of migrants from China. The tragedy revealed an international pipeline of human smuggling that stunned the public. Investigators traced parts of the operation back to groups with links to Asian triads, highlighting how local Tongs sometimes acted as gateways for global networks. Inside Chinatown, everyday life and hidden crime often existed side by side. Traditional festivals went on with lion dances and firecrackers, while behind closed doors, gambling parlors buzzed through the night. Shop owners might quietly pay for protection, seeing it as the cost of doing business rather than an act of fear. To outsiders, the area seemed peaceful, but insiders knew the delicate balance that kept the streets calm. The money involved was significant. Underground casinos drew steady crowds, while counterfeit designer goods and untaxed cigarettes brought quick profit. Some Tongs used legitimate businesses, shipping companies, travel agencies, import-export firms as fronts. This allowed them to move funds across borders with ease, making their operations hard to trace. Law enforcement faced unique challenges. Language barriers and strong community ties made infiltration difficult. Detectives often relied on long-term undercover work, carefully building trust to gather information. Even when arrests were made, leadership structures were hard to crack. Elders guided decisions quietly, and loyalty codes discouraged cooperation with outsiders. At the same time, Chinatown itself was not defined solely by crime. Community leaders, shopkeepers, and families worked tirelessly to build schools, health clinics, and cultural centers. Many residents resented the way sensational headlines painted their neighborhood. They saw the Tongs and triads as a hidden minority, not the true face of Chinatown life. Yet those hidden groups left a lasting mark. Their ability to operate in the shadows showed how organized crime could thrive without open violence, relying instead on trust, secrecy, and centuries-old traditions. In a decade when many gangs flaunted their presence, the Chinatown networks proved that silence could be just as powerful. While these quiet operations played out downtown, another community across the river was building its own influence. In Brooklyn's Brighton Beach and other pockets of the city, Russian-speaking immigrants were shaping a different kind of underworld, one that combined old country connections with sharp modern finance. The rise of the so-called Russian and Eastern European connections would add an international twist to New York's criminal map, and that is where our journey turns next. Russian and Eastern European connections. On a chilly night in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, the smell of fresh-baked pierogi and the sound of Russian pop music filled the air. This seaside neighborhood, nicknamed Little Odessa, had long been a welcoming place for immigrants from the former Soviet Union. Families gathered in cozy cafes, children played under the boardwalk, and stores displayed Cyrillic signs alongside English ones. But during the 1990s, something else quietly took root here. A network of Russian and Eastern European organized crime that would soon stretch from New York to global financial hubs. Many of the key players were seasoned opportunists. Some had backgrounds in black market trading back in Moscow, Kyiv, or Tbilisi during the last days of the Soviet Union. They arrived in the United States with sharp business instincts and contacts that spanned continents. In New York, they found a perfect environment, plenty of cash-based businesses, large immigrant communities, and gaps in law enforcement knowledge about their language and methods. At first, their activities seemed modest. Small groups ran schemes like selling untaxed cigarettes or moving stolen goods. But these were only the visible tip. Beneath the surface, more ambitious plans unfolded. Sophisticated insurance frauds, fuel tax scams, and elaborate money laundering operations. They used restaurants, nightclubs, and even medical clinics as fronts, mixing legitimate trade with hidden profit. One of their trademarks was flexibility. Rather than forming a single, easily targeted organization, the so-called Red Mafia operated in loose cells. Individuals joined forces for specific deals, then split and reassembled in new combinations. This made them hard to track. Investigators might think they had dismantled a network, only to discover the same players reappearing in a different borough under a new business name. Violence was not their first tool, but it remained a shadow in the background. Stories circulated of quiet threats, sudden disappearances, or fires that conveniently erased evidence. These incidents rarely reached the headlines, yet they reinforced reputations. Merchants and competitors knew that a polite request from certain men carried weight far beyond the words. International connections gave these groups a powerful advantage. With friends and relatives still in Russia, Ukraine, and other former Soviet republics, they could move money and goods across borders with ease. Smuggling high-end cars, trafficking rare art, or shifting millions through overseas banks became routine. Some schemes stretched to Europe, Israel, and even back to Moscow's fast-changing economy. Law enforcement faced steep challenges. Detectives needed translators fluent in Russian and Ukrainian, and the financial crimes often involved complex paper trails that crossed multiple countries. Federal agencies launched long-term investigations, but progress was slow. Each breakthrough revealed how quickly these networks could reinvent themselves. For the everyday residents of Brighton Beach, life was full of contrasts. Families celebrated weddings in glittering banquet halls, and children attended good schools. At the same time, everyone seemed to know a story about someone who did business on the side, or who suddenly returned from a mysterious overseas trip with a fortune. The line between rumor and reality was often thin. Popular culture soon picked up on this intrigue. Movies and novels portrayed Russian gangsters as cunning and unpredictable, adding a new character type to the city's crime lore. While these depictions were sometimes exaggerated, they reflected a real sense that a fresh international player had entered New York's underworld. By the late 90s, Russian and Eastern European crews had proven that modern crime could be both global and deeply local, anchored in neighborhood cafes, yet capable of moving millions with a single phone call. Their presence added an international dimension to the city's already complex gang landscape. Meanwhile, another cultural force was shaping the decade in a different way. From small recording studios in the Bronx to packed nightclubs in Manhattan, hip-hop was rising as a defining soundtrack of the era. This music would become both a mirror and a magnet for the city's underground life. To see how street energy and music blended into a powerful cultural wave, we turn next to the story of how hip-hop and hustle became inseparable in 90s New York. From hip-hop to hustle, on any warm night in mid-90s New York, music was everywhere. Boom boxes thumped on stoops, DJs scratched in smoky clubs, and new mixtapes changed hands in subway stations. Hip-hop wasn't just entertainment, it was the city's heartbeat, a language of ambition and survival. But as the beat spread, it carried more than rhymes. It carried the codes, rivalries, and hustle of the streets, weaving music and gang culture into a single, restless current. Hip-hop had always told real stories of struggle, but the 90s gave those stories a sharper edge. Artists rapped about growing up in neighborhoods where unemployment was high and danger was part of daily life. Their lyrics described the choices many young listeners faced: quick money through street deals or the long shot of making it in music or sports. The honesty drew huge audiences, yet it also blurred lines between performance and reality. Record labels noticed the hunger for gritty authenticity. Executives scouted not only talented rappers, but also figures with undeniable street reputations. A background in a known crew could suddenly become a marketing asset, proof that an artist's words came from lived experience. This fed a cycle in which some gang members began to see music as an extension of their hustle, while some musicians kept one foot in the underground for credibility. Nightclubs and recording studios became crossroads. Crews used parties to celebrate success, but also to make deals or settle scores. Security at hip-hop events was intense, not only because of celebrity, but because rival groups sometimes used these spaces to send signals or stage confrontations. For club owners, a hot show could mean packed rooms and big profits, or an unexpected brawl and a police visit. Fashion amplified the mix. Oversized jackets, Timberland boots, and gold chains carried more than style. They broadcasted neighborhood pride and sometimes quiet gang affiliation. A red or blue cap might be pure fashion for one person, a declaration of loyalty for another. As trends spread across MTV and music magazines, the city's streets became runways where coded messages walked in plain sight. At the same time, hip-hop offered a remarkable path upward. Many performers used their earnings to open clothing lines, record labels, or community programs. Some employed childhood friends, giving them legitimate income and a way out of the street economy. The entrepreneurial spirit turned music into a full-scale industry, creating wealth that rivaled established corporate brands. Yet the close dance between culture and crime sometimes led to danger. High-profile feuds between East Coast and West Coast artists, though partly fueled by media hype, occasionally drew in real neighborhood rivalries. A single lyric could spark weeks of tension. Police units learned to monitor new album releases almost like intelligence reports, reading lyrics for hints of upcoming conflicts. The influence didn't stop with music. Film, magazines, and even advertising borrowed hip-hop's raw energy. Movies set in New York portrayed the streets as both risk and inspiration. Clothing companies hired rappers as spokespeople, spreading the style from Harlem to suburban malls across America. What began as local storytelling became global culture, yet its roots in struggle and hustle remained visible. For many young people, this period proved that creativity could outshine crime. Aspiring DJs and MCs saw neighbors sign record deals and tour the world. Community centers turned into makeshift studios. Schools launched poetry slams that tapped into the same rhythm and wordplay. Even in neighborhoods still wrestling with poverty, art became a doorway to opportunity. By the late 90s, hip-hop was more than music. It was an economic engine and a social map of New York itself. Its growth mirrored the choices facing countless residents: to hustle in the shadows, to turn talent into enterprise, or as many did, to navigate both worlds at once. But as music and nightlife brought people together, the city's law enforcement agencies were changing their own playbook. Determined to curb rising violence and reclaim public spaces, the NYPD prepared new strategies that would redefine urban policing and directly challenge the gangs shaping the soundtrack of the decade. NYPD's high-stakes response. By the mid-90s, the sound of police radios and flashing blue lights had become part of New York's nightly rhythm. Residents wanted safer streets, and city leaders promised action. But the gangs and criminal networks of the decade were unlike anything the NYPD had faced before: loose, fast-moving, and sometimes global. To meet the challenge, the department decided it needed a new kind of strategy, one that combined data, technology, and relentless street work. The first big shift came with a system called CompStat, launched in the mid-90s. For the first time, precinct commanders were required to present detailed weekly crime statistics. Computer maps highlighted trouble spots, and hard numbers replaced guesswork. The new approach forced local leaders to react quickly and to answer tough questions from the top brass. Crime maps on big screens became the city's new battlefield, showing in red and blue exactly where robberies, shootings, or gang activity were clustering. Specialized units followed. The gang division expanded, focusing on emerging groups like the Bloods, Crips, Latin Kings, and Trinitarios. Undercover officers learned slang, studied graffiti tags, and built long-term cases. Surveillance technology improved, with better wiretaps and hidden cameras. Detectives could track payphone calls and pager messages, still the main communication tools of the era, more efficiently than ever before. The department also embraced the broken windows philosophy. The idea was simple: fix small problems to prevent bigger crimes. Crews were sent to clean graffiti from subway cars, stop fare evaders, and shut down illegal gambling rooms. Supporters believed that sending a message of order would discourage more serious offenses. Critics argued that this approach risked over-policing, especially in Black and Latino neighborhoods. Large-scale sweeps became common. When violence flared between rival gangs, police often flooded entire blocks with officers searching for weapons and making mass arrests. These operations sometimes produced dramatic results, seizing guns and drugs and capturing key suspects. But they also created tension with residents who felt treated as suspects simply for living in certain areas. Community partnerships grew alongside the tough tactics. Precincts held meetings with local leaders, faith groups, and tenant associations to share information and hear concerns. Youth programs received modest funding, aiming to offer alternatives to gang life. The balance between outreach and enforcement remained delicate, but both sides recognized that one approach alone could not solve the problem. Meanwhile, high-profile investigations tested every tool in the NYPD's kit. Using the federal RICO law, prosecutors linked violent crimes to organized enterprises, bringing down entire crews rather than just individual offenders. Some cases stretched for years, involving hidden cameras in bodegas, undercover buys, and patient decoding of pager codes. Each successful prosecution sent ripples through the underworld, warning that secrecy was no longer protection. The public saw results. By the late 90s, major crime rates dropped noticeably. Murders fell to levels not seen in decades. Subways felt safer, and once-feared neighborhoods began to draw new businesses and families. Many residents credited the NYPD's relentless focus and modern methods. Others pointed to broader trends, economic growth, demographic changes, and the natural life cycle of gang conflicts as equally important factors. Inside the force, the era reshaped careers and culture. Young officers trained with an eye on data and rapid response. Veteran detectives learned to work with new technology and more complex financial evidence. The department as a whole became more analytical, setting a model that other cities soon studied. Yet, every success story carried unresolved questions. Community advocates warned that heavy stop-and-frisk tactics eroded trust. Former gang members argued that poverty and lack of opportunity remained the deeper causes of violence. Even some police leaders admitted that lasting peace required more than arrests and statistics. By the closing years of the decade, New York was undeniably changing. Streets once feared after dark were busy again, with late-night cafes and music venues. But the city's underworld wasn't disappearing, it was shifting shape. As the pressure of law enforcement mounted, many gangs faced hard choices: fight, fade, or transform. In the next stage of this story, we'll see how internal conflicts and outside crackdowns pushed these groups toward turning points that would redefine the criminal landscape of New York. Turning points and crumbling empires. By the late 1990s, the energy on New York streets felt different. Neighborhoods once ruled by fear were showing signs of renewal. Coffee shops and late-night eateries popped up where shuttered storefronts had stood for years. Children played a little longer after school, but under the surface, a quieter drama unfolded. Many of the gangs that had shaped the decade, whether old mafia families, prison-born crews, or flashy newcomers, were approaching a crossroads. Internal struggles, stronger policing, and shifting economics all converged to challenge their power. Law enforcement pressure was relentless. The NYPD's data-driven CompStat strategy meant that every spike in violence drew immediate attention. Federal prosecutors used the RICO law to tie together years of evidence, treating each gang as a single criminal enterprise. These sweeping cases didn't just target low-level members. They aimed at the core leadership. Arrests that once removed a few individuals now threatened entire hierarchies. Inside the gangs, stress lines deepened. The Latin kings debated whether to focus on social outreach or underground profit, creating splits between older leaders and ambitious young members. Bloods and Crips set sometimes feuded among themselves over money or territory, diluting their strength. Even the storied five families faced succession battles as cautious elders and impatient upstarts clashed over how visible to be in a new era of surveillance. Economic changes added another twist. The booming late 90s economy brought new jobs and a wave of investment into long-neglected neighborhoods. Former drug hotspots slowly filled with renovated apartments and legitimate businesses. For young people, opportunities outside the street economy, construction, retail, music, technology began to look more realistic than before. The easy money that once made gangs so attractive started to lose its shine. Community activism also played a key role. Local block associations, church groups, and youth mentors organized after-school programs, sports leagues, and job fairs. These efforts didn't always make headlines, but they chipped away at the sense that joining a gang was the only way to belong or to stay safe. Some former members stepped forward as outreach workers, sharing personal stories of loss and second chances. Media attention shifted as well. While sensational stories of gang violence still appeared, newspapers increasingly covered neighborhood revitalization and success stories of youth programs. Hip-hop itself began to explore new themes, with artists highlighting business ventures and family life alongside street tales. The cultural narrative slowly widened, allowing more paths for young ambition. Still, decline did not mean disappearance. Some crews went underground, operating with more subtlety and less open violence. Others pivoted to white-collar crimes like identity theft, credit card fraud, or internet scams, which were harder to trace with old policing methods. The shape of organized crime changed, becoming less visible, but not necessarily less profitable. For law enforcement, this created new challenges. How do you measure success when crime moves off the street and into encrypted computer networks or global finance? Detectives who once read graffiti for clues now needed training in cybercrime and international banking. The city's next battles would be fought as much in data centers as on dark corners. By the turn of the millennium, many of the once dominant gangs of the 90s had fractured, adapted, or faded. The Latin Kings saw key leaders imprisoned or choosing reform. The Trinitarios maintained a presence but faced constant pressure. The five families lost their public swagger, focusing on quieter, more technical ventures. Bloods and Crips remained, but often as smaller, more localized sets rather than citywide forces. For everyday New Yorkers, the difference was tangible. Streets felt safer, and the constant tension of the early 90s eased. Yet memories lingered of sirens at midnight, of names whispered with caution, of entire blocks once known by a single gang's reputation. These memories shaped how communities viewed safety, trust, and opportunity for years to come. The fall of many 90s gangs did not simply close a violent chapter. It set the stage for something lasting. The lessons of those years influenced policing strategies, community organizing, and even pop culture. As the city moved into a new millennium, it carried both the scars and the hard-won knowledge of a turbulent decade. And so we arrive at the final perspective of this journey, what all these struggles, rises, and collapses left behind. The lasting imprint of the 90s gangs on neighborhoods, on culture, and on the very identity of New York remains a story worth telling as we look at the legacy they left. The legacy they left. As the calendar turned to the new millennium, New York City felt transformed. Streets once whispered about for late-night danger now drew families to cafes and music venues. Subway rides that had once meant scanning every car for trouble became routine commutes. But beneath the new calm lay a complicated inheritance from the gangs of the 1990s, an imprint that still shapes the city in ways both obvious and subtle. One part of that legacy lives in culture. The decade's hip-hop boom carried the slang, fashion, and street codes of its time into global music and style. Red and blue bandanas, gold and black jackets, and Bronx-born phrases traveled far beyond the five boroughs. Films and television series turned real-life sagas of crews like the Latin Kings, Trinitarios, and Russian-speaking outfits into dramas watched around the world. Even today, references to those years give songs and stories an edge of authenticity. Another part lies in the city's physical and social map. Some neighborhoods that gangs once ruled still bear the marks of those invisible borders. A single block might carry memories of a notorious hangout spot or a long-ago truce. Older residents can point out buildings where pivotal arrests happened or where influential meetings once took place. These memories become a kind of unofficial history, passed down in family conversations and neighborhood law. Policing, too, carries the imprint. CompStat, the data-driven system born in that era, is now standard across many American cities. Tactics like rapid response to emerging hotspots and coordinated long-term investigations grew directly from lessons learned in the 90s. Even debates about the limits of stop and frisk or the need for community policing trace back to that period's experiments and controversies. The gang's influence can also be felt in how New Yorkers think about opportunity and resilience. Stories of people who left crews to start businesses, mentor youth, or build careers remind residents that transformation is possible. Community groups that began as emergency responses to violence have matured into permanent organizations offering job training, cultural programs, and legal aid. Yet the legacy is not only positive. The traumas of that time lost lives, fractured families, long prison terms still echo. Many who grew up during those years carry memories of constant sirens and sudden losses. For them, the safer city of today is a welcome change, but also a reminder of what it cost to get here. Importantly, the 90s also proved that crime itself adapts. As street shootings declined, some former networks shifted into quieter, more technical forms of profit: cyber fraud, credit scams, international smuggling. The outward symbols faded, but the drive for hidden income remained. This ongoing evolution challenges the city to keep learning and adjusting. New York's own identity absorbed these lessons. The city's reputation for toughness, for endless reinvention, partly comes from surviving that turbulent decade. People remember how art, community action, and smart policing combined sometimes clashed to pull neighborhoods back from the edge. Those memories feed a civic confidence. If the city could get through the 90s, it can handle the future. Walk today through Washington Heights, the Bronx, or Brighton Beach, and you'll see children playing where older generations once traded wary glances. Street murals honor not only famous artists, but also local peacemakers and mentors. Old storefronts are now cafes, studios, and bookstores. Yet the stories of the gangs remain, like an underground current, reminding everyone how fragile peace can be and how hard-won progress truly is. The tale of New York's 90s gangs is therefore more than a catalogue of crimes. It is a story about transformation of individuals, of neighborhoods, and of an entire city. It shows how culture and conflict can shape each other, how danger can spark creativity, and how communities can reclaim their streets without losing their spirit. Looking back from today, the decade stands as both warning and inspiration. The city learned that violence can erupt quickly when opportunity is scarce, but it also proved that determination, art, and smart action can turn fear into renewal. The gangs of the 90s are mostly gone or changed beyond recognition. Yet the lessons they left behind continue to guide New York, offering hard-earned wisdom for the challenges of tomorrow.